In this episode, we're going to make tracking technologies feel understandable and governable, because this is one of the fastest places for privacy intent to get lost behind convenience, marketing pressure, and technical complexity. Beginners often hear the word cookies and think it is only about remembering a login, but modern tracking includes many mechanisms that can observe behavior across sessions, across devices, and sometimes across sites and apps. Those mechanisms can be used for legitimate purposes like security and performance, but they can also be used to build profiles, target advertising, and measure behavior in ways users do not expect. The privacy challenge is that tracking is often embedded through third-party tools and default configurations, which can cause data collection to happen silently unless governance is deliberate. Governing tracking means creating clear rules for what is allowed, what is prohibited, and what conditions must be met before tracking data is collected or shared. By the end, you should be able to explain what tracking technologies do at a high level, why cookie management is more than a banner, and how enforceable rules prevent accidental overcollection and unintended disclosure. A solid foundation begins with defining cookies and tracking in practical terms. A cookie is a small piece of data stored by a browser that can be sent back to a server on future requests, allowing the server to recognize the browser and maintain state. Cookies can be used for essential functions like keeping a user logged in or remembering a shopping cart, and in those cases they support the user experience. Tracking technologies are broader than cookies and include things like web beacons, pixel tags, local storage, device fingerprinting techniques, software development kit tracking inside mobile apps, and unique identifiers embedded in links. The common theme is that these mechanisms create continuity, meaning they allow behavior to be linked across time or contexts. Beginners should notice that continuity is not automatically bad, because continuity can support fraud prevention, account security, and feature personalization, but continuity becomes privacy risk when it supports unexpected profiling or sharing. Another important concept is that tracking often collects metadata rather than content, such as pages visited, clicks, timing, and device characteristics, and metadata can still be personal when it is linkable to an identity. When you see tracking as a continuity engine, you can evaluate it more clearly than if you treat it as a vague marketing concept. Governance starts with purpose, because the same tracking mechanism can be appropriate or inappropriate depending on what it is used for. One purpose category is essential functionality, where tracking supports core operations like authentication, security, and transaction completion. Another category is performance and reliability, where tracking helps measure errors, latency, and user experience issues so teams can improve the product. Another category is analytics, where tracking helps understand usage patterns and product adoption, and this can range from aggregated, privacy-preserving measurement to detailed individual profiling. Another category is marketing and advertising, where tracking can be used to build audiences, measure campaigns, and retarget users across contexts. Beginners should understand that these categories matter because they map to different expectations and often to different consent requirements. Treating all tracking as the same creates either overly strict controls that break essential functions or overly permissive controls that allow intrusive profiling. Clear governance, therefore, defines categories, ties them to allowed data elements, and defines what conditions must be met before tracking starts. When purpose categories are explicit, teams can make consistent decisions and avoid the common drift where a performance tool quietly becomes a profiling tool over time. A key privacy risk is third-party tracking, because third parties can receive data and use it beyond the context the user expects. When a site loads third-party scripts, pixels, or embedded content, a user's browser may contact third-party servers, sharing identifiers, device information, and behavioral signals. Even if the site never sends a name, the third party can often link the activity to profiles built elsewhere. Beginners often assume a website is a single entity, but modern pages can include many parties, each collecting data, and the user usually does not understand that complexity. This is why cookie management and tracking governance must consider not only what the organization intends, but what embedded third parties are technically able to do. Third-party scripts can also change without warning, introducing new data collection behavior after an update, which makes governance harder if it relies only on initial review. A privacy-aware approach limits third-party trackers, prefers first-party measurement when possible, and ensures that any third-party tracking is justified, minimized, and governed with clear contractual and technical safeguards. When third-party tracking is uncontrolled, privacy risk grows quickly because the organization loses visibility and control over downstream use. Cookie management is often presented as a banner problem, but in privacy engineering it is better understood as an enforcement system that controls whether tracking technologies are activated. A banner or preference screen is only the user interface layer, and it is meaningless if the underlying scripts and tags run regardless of the user's choices. Beginners should recognize that cookie consent is not only about storing cookies, but about triggering or blocking tracking behaviors in a reliable way. This includes preventing non-essential scripts from loading until the correct choice exists, preventing identifiers from being set, and preventing data from being sent to third parties before consent is obtained when consent is required. Another key idea is that preferences must be remembered and applied consistently across sessions and across subdomains and apps where appropriate, because inconsistent enforcement leads to surprising behavior. Cookie management also needs to handle changes, such as when new trackers are introduced or when purposes change, because consent is tied to purpose and users should not be silently opted into expanded tracking. When cookie management is enforceable, user choice becomes real rather than decorative. Enforceability is the difference between a privacy program and a marketing compliance veneer. To create clear rules, organizations often classify tracking technologies by necessity and risk because necessity determines what must function even without optional permissions. Essential tracking supports basic operations like authentication, security, load balancing, and user-requested features, and it should be narrowly scoped and minimized. Non-essential tracking includes analytics and marketing, and it should be disabled by default until appropriate permission exists, depending on the organization's consent basis and jurisdictional requirements. Beginners should understand that essential does not mean unlimited, because essential tracking can still be misused if it collects more than necessary or persists longer than needed. A privacy-aware rule set defines what essential tracking may collect, how long it may persist, and what sharing is permitted, often limiting it to first-party use. For non-essential tracking, rules should specify which categories are allowed, what data elements can be captured, whether identifiers can be used, and whether third parties can receive data. Clear rules also define what is prohibited, such as tracking that enables cross-site profiling without permission or device fingerprinting used to bypass user choices. When rules are explicit, teams can implement them consistently and auditors can evaluate them objectively. Without explicit rules, decisions become ad hoc and driven by short-term goals. Retention is another area where cookie and tracking governance often fails, because tracking identifiers can persist and enable long-term profiling. A cookie's lifespan determines how long a user can be recognized, and long lifespans increase privacy risk by extending linkability across time. Beginners should connect this to minimization, because minimizing persistence is a form of minimizing data. Shorter lifetimes reduce the ability to build long-term behavioral histories, and they reduce exposure if identifiers are leaked or misused. Retention rules also apply to the data collected through tracking, such as clickstream logs, analytics events, and advertising conversion records, which can persist long after the tracking mechanism itself expires. A privacy-aware program sets retention periods that match the purpose, such as shorter periods for detailed event data and longer periods for aggregated metrics that cannot be linked to individuals. Another important concept is deletion and revocation, because if a user withdraws permission for tracking, the system should stop collecting going forward and should handle previously collected data according to policy and obligations. Retention discipline prevents tracking from becoming an indefinite archive of behavior. When persistence is controlled, privacy intent remains visible over time. Governance must also address how tracking intersects with authentication and account-based personalization, because logged-in contexts can create powerful linkability. When a user is authenticated, tracking can be tied directly to an identity, which increases sensitivity and increases the potential harm of misuse. Beginners sometimes assume that if a user has an account, anything can be tracked, but privacy intent still depends on purpose, transparency, and consent where required. Account-based tracking should therefore be more tightly governed, ensuring that data collected for security and service delivery is not automatically repurposed for marketing or unrelated profiling. Another issue is cross-device tracking, where identifiers are used to connect behavior on a phone and a laptop, which can feel intrusive if not clearly explained and controlled. A privacy-aware rule set defines what kinds of linkage are permitted, under what conditions, and how users can opt out. It also ensures that personalization features do not become hidden tracking mechanisms that collect more data than needed. When account-based contexts are handled carefully, organizations can provide useful features without turning the user relationship into a surveillance relationship. Mobile app tracking introduces additional complexity because apps often rely on embedded software development kits that collect data in the background and may share it with third parties. Beginners should understand that app tracking can include device identifiers, advertising identifiers, location signals, and usage events, and these can be highly sensitive when combined. App tracking governance needs clear rules about what identifiers are allowed, what data can be collected, and how user choices are honored, especially because some mobile platforms have their own permission systems. Another important point is that apps can continue collecting data even when the user is not actively engaging, depending on permissions, which can create unexpected data collection. A privacy-aware program audits embedded components, limits third-party trackers, and ensures that preference changes are enforced immediately. It also treats app telemetry as data assets with owners, classification, retention, and access controls, because telemetry often includes linkable identifiers. When apps are governed with the same rigor as web experiences, tracking risk is reduced across devices and contexts. Without that rigor, tracking can quietly expand because app ecosystems make it easy to add components that collect data by default. Preventing silent tracking is one of the most important goals of governance, because the worst privacy failures are the ones users never see. Silent tracking can occur when scripts load before consent, when third-party content triggers tracking regardless of settings, or when fingerprinting techniques collect identifying signals without storing cookies. Beginners should recognize that blocking cookies does not necessarily block all tracking, because trackers can use other storage mechanisms and device characteristics. This is why enforceable rules should include technical controls and regular testing, not just policy statements. Testing can include verifying that non-essential tags do not fire before permission, verifying that opt-out actually stops outbound requests to tracking domains, and verifying that preference changes persist. Another key practice is change management, because tracking technologies often change when marketing teams add new tags, when vendors update scripts, or when product teams introduce new analytics features. Without review and approval processes, new trackers can appear and begin collecting data immediately, bypassing governance. When governance includes detection and review, silent tracking becomes harder to introduce and easier to catch. Transparency and user choice are also part of enforceable governance, because rules must be understandable and actionable, not buried in vague statements. Beginners should understand that clear notice is about describing what tracking occurs, why it occurs, what data is collected, who receives it, and what choices the user has. Choices should be granular enough to be meaningful, such as separating essential functions from analytics and marketing, but not so complex that users cannot understand them. Another important design point is avoiding dark patterns, where interfaces push users toward accepting tracking without understanding the consequences. Privacy intent is preserved when the user's choice is respected across all tracking mechanisms, not just cookies. Governance should also ensure that preference records are protected and that consent states are not manipulated or reset without justification, because consent integrity is part of trust. When transparency and choice are treated as enforceable requirements, tracking becomes a managed capability rather than an uncontrolled data capture system. Clear rules are not only about what the organization allows itself to do, but about what it commits to honoring. Operational governance requires ownership, inventory, and continuous oversight, because tracking technologies are dynamic and can spread across many pages, apps, and services. An organization should maintain an inventory of trackers, including first-party and third-party components, and that inventory should document purpose, data elements, recipients, and retention expectations. Beginners should recognize that without an inventory, you cannot reliably enforce rules, because you cannot control what you cannot see. Governance also requires review processes for new trackers and for changes in existing trackers, so that expansions in data collection do not happen silently. Monitoring can support governance by detecting outbound requests to known tracking endpoints and flagging unexpected new endpoints, which helps catch unauthorized additions. Another operational need is vendor governance, because third-party trackers are effectively disclosures, and the organization must ensure that vendors adhere to restrictions on use, sharing, and retention. When these operational practices are in place, cookie management and tracking control remain stable over time rather than decaying as teams change and products evolve. Stability is what turns a policy into a reliable privacy control. As we conclude, the central lesson is that tracking technologies and cookies must be governed as privacy-relevant data flows with clear categories, enforceable controls, and ongoing oversight. Cookies are one mechanism for maintaining continuity, but modern tracking includes many other techniques, and governance must address the full ecosystem rather than focusing on banners alone. Clear rules begin with purpose classification, distinguishing essential tracking from non-essential tracking, and defining what data can be collected, how long it can persist, and who can receive it. Enforceable cookie management means that user choices actually control whether trackers load and whether data is transmitted, preventing silent tracking and preventing third-party collection before permission exists when required. Retention discipline, especially around identifier lifespan and event data storage, reduces long-term profiling and supports lifecycle promises. Account-based and mobile contexts require heightened care because linkability increases sensitivity and the potential for unexpected collection. Operational success depends on inventories, ownership, change control, vendor oversight, and testing that verifies that controls work in reality. When you can explain tracking governance as a system of rules that are not only written but technically enforced, you demonstrate a key privacy engineering capability, turning user expectations into consistent behavior across a constantly changing digital environment.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.